From the ancient echoes of forgotten empires to the blood and hope of a nation reborn, Ukraine's story is one of survival, pride, and unbreakable spirit. A land where kings once ruled from golden-domed cities, where empires fought for centuries to claim its soul. Through war, famine, and revolution, the Ukrainian people never surrendered their identity. This is not just the story of a country, it's the story of endurance itself. A journey through 1,000 years of struggle and strength. This is the entire history of Ukraine, a land that refused to disappear. Long before the borders of modern Europe were drawn, there existed a vast and fertile land, endless plains stretching between the Carpathian Mountains and the Black Sea. This was the heart of Eastern Europe, a crossroads of civilizations, trade, and conquest. That land would one day be known as Ukraine, but its story begins more than 1,000 years ago, with a people, a culture, and a spirit that would outlive empires. In the 9th century, powerful tribes of Slavs, Vikings, and nomads shaped the early identity of this region. Out of their uniting came the first great Eastern European state, Kyivan Rus. Centered in the city of Kyiv, it was a kingdom of gold-domed churches, bustling markets, and foreign envoys who came to witness its glory. Under the rule of Prince Vladimir the Great in the year 988, Kyivan Rus embraced Christianity from Byzantium, forever linking its culture to Europe rather than the steppe. Kyiv became a beacon of faith and learning, known as the mother of all Rus cities. But as history often shows, golden ages are fragile. After Vladimir's death, the princes of Rus began to fight among themselves. Power fractured. By the 13th century, a storm from the east descended upon the land, the Mongol invasion. Cities were burned, Kyiv was destroyed, and the once great Rus civilization was reduced to ashes. For centuries after, the Ukrainian lands became divided and conquered by foreign powers: Lithuanians, Poles, Ottomans, and eventually the Russian Tsars. Yet, even under foreign rule, the Ukrainian spirit refused to die. In the 16th and 17th centuries, a new force rose from the wild southern steppes: the Cossacks. Fierce independent warriors who lived by their own laws, the Cossacks became symbols of freedom and defiance. They built fortresses, fought invaders, and created their own semi-independent state, the Cossack Hetmanate. Their leader, Bohdan Khmelnytsky, led a massive uprising in 1648, seeking to liberate Ukraine from Polish domination. For a brief moment it seemed that independence was within reach, but geopolitics would again seal Ukraine's fate. In 1654, Khmelnytsky signed the Treaty of Pereyaslav, aligning the Cossack Hetmanate with the Tsardom of Russia, an alliance that promised protection but eventually led to domination. Over the next 2 centuries, Ukraine's autonomy eroded. By the 18th century, the Russian Empire under Catherine the Great had absorbed most of Ukraine, while Western lands fell under Austrian control. The Cossack identity was suppressed, and the very name Ukraine, meaning borderland, was used to define it as a territory, not a nation. Yet language, songs, and folktales kept the soul alive. Ukrainian poets and writers of the 19th century like Taras Shevchenko rekindled national consciousness. Shevchenko's poetry spoke of lost freedom, of peasants bound to the empire, and of a homeland yearning for dignity. His words became the fire that lit a movement, one that dreamed of Ukraine not as a province, but as a people. As the 20th century dawned, that dream turned into struggle. The First World War shattered empires, and in its ruins, nations sought to be reborn. In 1917, after the Russian Revolution, Ukraine declared independence as the Ukrainian People's Republic. For a moment, flags of blue and yellow fluttered freely, but independence was brief. Civil war erupted. The Red Army invaded. By 1922, Ukraine was absorbed into the newly formed Soviet Union. The Soviet era would mark one of the darkest chapters in Ukrainian history. Under Joseph Stalin, Ukraine faced a catastrophe that still echoes through generations: the Holodomor, the Great Famine of 1932-1933. Grain was seized, villages starved, and millions perished. Official Soviet records denied it for decades, but the scars remained. Families whispered the stories at night, afraid to speak them aloud. It was a silent genocide, one that sought to break the Ukrainian will, but failed. Then came World War II. Ukraine became one of the bloodiest battlegrounds on earth. Nazi Germany invaded in 1941, and millions of Ukrainians were caught between two brutal regimes, the Nazis and the Soviets. Entire cities were destroyed. Kyiv was reduced to ruins. Over 5 million Ukrainians lost their lives during the war, both soldiers and civilians. Yet again, Ukraine became a land of ashes. But from those ashes, resistance grew. Ukrainian partisans fought both occupiers, dreaming still of freedom. When the war ended in 1945, Ukraine remained part of the Soviet Union, but its people were changed forever. Factories were rebuilt, cities modernized, and education expanded, but under a tight grip of censorship and control. Ukrainian language and culture were often suppressed, replaced with Russian dominance. Still, beneath the surface, a quiet sense of identity persisted. Every generation found a way to remember who they were. In 1986, a disaster would once again bring the world's attention to Ukraine, the Chernobyl nuclear catastrophe. An explosion at the Chernobyl power plant released deadly radiation across Europe. It was one of the worst nuclear disasters in history. Thousands were evacuated, entire cities abandoned. The Soviet government tried to conceal the truth, but the disaster became a symbol of the decay and secrecy of the Soviet system itself. Chernobyl exposed not just a reactor's failure, but an empire's cracks. Just 5 years later, those cracks widened into collapse. Across Eastern Europe, communism was falling. The Berlin Wall had crumbled, and the Soviet Union trembled. On August 24, 1991, the Ukrainian parliament declared independence. The blue and yellow flag rose once again over Kyiv, this time not as a dream, but as reality. After centuries of domination, Ukraine had finally reclaimed its place on the map of the world. But independence was only the beginning of a new chapter. The years that followed were filled with both promise and struggle. Ukraine faced corruption, economic instability, and political divisions. It walked a tightrope between East and West, between its Soviet past and its European future. Yet even in the hardest times, the same spirit that carried it through 1,000 years of conquest remained alive. The story of Ukraine is not merely about borders or governments. It's about endurance. It's about a people who built cities when empires fell, who sang songs when they were forbidden to speak, and who carried hope through centuries of loss. From the glory of Kyivan Rus to the shadow of Chernobyl, from oppression to freedom, Ukraine's journey stands as one of history's most powerful tales of resilience. And as the 20th century came to an end, Ukraine stood on the threshold of a new era, free, sovereign, but aware that freedom must always be defended. The long road from ancient Kyiv to modern independence had been paved with sacrifice, courage, and unbreakable will. The world watched as a nation once silenced finally found its voice. This is Ukraine's story, 1,000 years of struggle, survival, and rebirth. A story that reminds us that no empire, no famine, no war can destroy the heart of a people who refuse to forget who they are. What defines a nation? The borders it holds, or the spirit it carries through centuries? If you believe history shapes the future, subscribe now to explore more untold stories. Independence did not arrive as a gift. It arrived as a test. When Ukraine raised its flag in 1991, the people knew that freedom was not the end of their struggle, but the beginning of a new one. Centuries of domination had taught them that a nation's true strength is not in the power of its rulers, but in the unity of its people. The early years of independence were uncertain. The Soviet Union had collapsed, but its shadow remained in industry, politics, and memory. Ukraine inherited a broken economy and an unstable system, yet its people carried a fierce optimism. They dreamed of a country that could stand proudly between East and West, where its culture could breathe freely and its voice could finally be heard on its own terms. The world saw Ukraine as a young nation, But the truth was deeper. It was an ancient soul reborn. The same rivers that carried Viking ships in the days of Kyivan Rus now carried the hopes of a modern republic. Farmers tilled the same black soil that once fed empires. Children learned the Ukrainian language that had survived centuries of suppression. Every sunrise over the Dnipro River felt like proof that history could be rewritten by those who endured it. Yet freedom came with contradictions. The 1990s were years of chaos and transition. The Soviet system had vanished overnight, leaving behind confusion and corruption. Factories closed, inflation soared, and ordinary people struggled to rebuild their lives. Still, even in hardship, Ukrainians held on to something priceless: the belief that they would never again live under someone else's flag. Throughout the 2000s, Ukraine's political life became a battleground between those who looked eastward to Russia and those who looked westward to Europe. The Orange Revolution of 2004 became a symbol of that choice. When millions filled Kyiv's Independence Square, wrapped in orange banners, they were not simply protesting an election. They were demanding dignity, truth, and democracy. In the freezing winter air, songs of hope echoed through the city. The world watched as ordinary citizens, unarmed and determined, forced corrupt power to yield. It was one of those rare moments when the spirit of a nation could be seen in every face. Though corruption and political struggle continued, the revolution marked something irreversible: the awakening of civic identity. Ukrainians realized that freedom was not a government's promise, but a people's duty. Culturally, Ukraine blossomed again. Folk traditions mixed with modern art, music, and literature. Ukrainian films gained recognition, its cuisine reached global tables, and its music crossed borders. The world began to rediscover Ukraine not as Russia's neighbor, but as a nation of its own voice, bold, proud, and distinct. In cities like Lviv, Kyiv, and Odessa, you could feel two worlds meeting: old Europe and modern energy. Street musicians played centuries-old melodies beside neon-lit cafes. Churches restored after decades of Soviet silence rang their bells once more. The Ukrainian flag, blue for the sky, yellow for the wheat, was not just a national emblem. It became a daily reminder of peace and work, heaven and earth. Yet history's weight was never far away. Older generations still remembered the famine, the wars, the censorship. Younger ones were building new dreams through technology, art, and education. That bridge between memory and modernity defined the country's soul. Ukraine was learning to live not in the past, but with the past. To honor it, not be imprisoned by it. One of the nation's greatest strengths has always been its people. Ukrainians are known for resilience, a quiet, stubborn endurance born from centuries of hardship. In the countryside, you'll find grandmothers who survived the famine tending gardens with the same care they give their grandchildren. In the cities, you'll meet young innovators turning old Soviet factories into startups. The same land that once endured invasion after invasion now produces scientists, artists, and dreamers. Every generation has fought in its own way, some with swords, others with songs, and now with ideas. That continuity, the belief that identity must never fade, is what defines Ukraine's heartbeat. Geographically, Ukraine has always been a borderland between worlds. The forests of the north and the steppe of the south, Catholic Europe and Orthodox Byzantium, modern capitalism and old empire. But being a borderland has also been its greatest strength. It has learned to absorb influences without losing itself, to take pain and turn it into art, oppression, and turn it into strength. As Ukraine entered the 21st century, it stood at a crossroads once more. The world around it changed rapidly: globalization, technology, migration. But its central question remained the same. What does it mean to be Ukrainian? For some, it meant defending language and tradition. For others, it meant forging progress and innovation. For all, it meant remembering the lessons of history, that freedom must never be taken for granted. From the churches of Kyiv to the sunflower fields of Kherson, from the Carpathian villages to the shores of the Black Sea, the land itself tells the story of endurance. Every monument, every old poem, every melody carries whispers of what it took to survive. Today, when you look at Ukraine, you don't just see a country. You see the living memory of Europe's past and the promise of its future. A place where struggle and beauty coexist. A nation that has known hunger and hope, tragedy and triumph, loss and love. And that is why the history of Ukraine matters. It is not just about kings and borders, wars and treaties. It is about how human will can outlast any empire. It reminds us that even when the world forgets, a people can remember themselves into existence. From the ancient stones of Kyiv's cathedrals to the laughter of children in independent Ukraine, the message remains the same. Identity survives. Nations rise and fall, but spirit endures. Ukraine's journey from Kyivan Rus to independence is one of the most extraordinary in human history. A 1,000-year testament to the power of resilience. Its people have seen darkness that defies words, yet they continue to plant, to sing, to build, and to dream. And as the sun sets over the golden fields of wheat, you can almost hear the whisper of history itself. We are still here. We always will be. Before the world knew the word Ukraine, before any border was drawn or flag was raised, there was a land wrapped in silence and legend. A place where the winds of the steppe whispered secrets to the rivers, where forgotten gods still lingered in the forests, and where destiny waited patiently beneath the soil. The mystery of Ukraine begins not in books or wars, but in the quiet pulse of a land that has always refused to die. Long before maps were made, this region, between the Carpathian Mountains and the Black Sea, was a bridge between civilizations. Traders, warriors, and dreamers passed through it, leaving their marks like shadows. The Scythians, fierce horsemen of the plains, once thundered across these fields. The Greeks sailed north to trade in its ports. And in time, the Norsemen came steering their ships down the Dnipro River, searching for a path to Byzantium. What they found instead was destiny. From their union with the Eastern Slavs was born something remarkable, the civilization of Kyivan Rus. Founded in the 9th century, it was not merely a state, it was a spark that lit Eastern Europe. Its capital, Kyiv, glowed with golden domes and the music of bells. Merchants arrived from Constantinople, Venice, and Baghdad. Scholars came to read, monks to write, and envoys to marvel. Under Prince Vladimir the Great, Kyivan Rus embraced Christianity in 988, forever tying itself to the legacy of Europe and the spirit of Byzantium. But beyond the splendor, something deeper stirred, a quiet mystery about identity. What was Kyivan Rus? Was it Russian, Belarusian, Ukrainian, or something older, something purer? The chronicles left behind tell us little. They speak of princes and wars, but not of the nameless people who tilled the land, who sang in a tongue that would one day become Ukrainian. Their voices were never written down, yet their songs survived, carried through centuries in lullabies and laments. As the centuries turned, the golden age began to fade. The unity of Rus cracked under ambition and betrayal. Brothers fought brothers for power. And in the 13th century, a shadow descended. The Mongols. They came with fire and thunder, and Kyiv, once the heart of the Slavic world, was reduced to ruins. Smoke rose where cathedrals once stood. Chronicles end mid-sentence, as if even the scribes had been silenced. Yet somehow, the people endured. Villages rose again on the ashes. Songs returned to the air. The mystery was not how Ukraine survived, but why it never ceased to dream. Over the centuries that followed, the land of Ukraine became a prize for empires. The Lithuanians came, then the Poles, then the Ottomans, and finally the Russians. Each empire claimed to protect it. Each sought to possess it. But Ukraine belonged to no one but its people. They carried the memory of Rus like an unbroken thread, weaving it into their language, faith, and folklore. In the 16th century, from the vast grasslands of the steppe, another symbol emerged, the Cossacks. They were rebels and defenders, outlaws and patriots. Living free beyond the reach of kings, they built fortified communities called Sikhs. To the empires, they were a threat. To the people, they were heroes. The Cossacks embodied what Ukraine had always been, wild, independent, untamed. Their songs spoke of freedom, their swords spoke of defiance. Under leaders like Bogdan Khmelnytsky, they challenged the mighty Polish crown and dreamed of an autonomous homeland. For a brief moment, it seemed that dream might come true. But fate, as always, had other plans. Seeking protection from stronger powers, Khmelnytsky signed a treaty with Moscow in 1654, an alliance that would slowly turn into domination. And thus began another cycle of control and resistance. The Russian Empire expanded, swallowing Ukraine piece by piece, while the western lands fell under Austrian rule. The word Ukraine, meaning borderland, became both a name and a curse. Yet even under foreign rule, something invisible persisted, the will to remain distinct. Writers and poets began to awaken that will. Taras Shevchenko, born a serf, became its voice. His poems spoke of loss, faith, and freedom, calling his people to remember who they were. His verses were forbidden, his books burned, yet his words traveled mouth to mouth, village to village. Through his pen, the spirit of Ukraine began to speak again. This was the mystery that no empire could solve, how a nation without borders could remain alive in the hearts of its people. They were forbidden to print their language, yet they sang it. They were denied independence, yet they dreamed of it. Every suppression only deepened their roots. By the dawn of the 20th century, the world was changing. Empires trembled, revolutions erupted, and amidst the chaos of the First World War, the dream resurfaced once more. In 1917, Ukraine declared independence. For a brief shining moment, it stood free, the Ukrainian People's Republic. But freedom came like lightning, brilliant and brief. The Red Army advanced, civil war followed, independence was drowned in blood. By 1922, Ukraine was absorbed into the Soviet Union. On the surface, it was a republic within a union. In truth, it was a nation in chains, but even chains could not erase memory. In secret, people still whispered the old songs, told the old stories, prayed in the old churches. The mystery endured. Then came one of history's darkest chapters, the Holodomor. In 1932 and 1933, under Stalin's rule, millions starved as grain was seized and villages left to die. Entire families vanished. Fields lay barren. The very soil seemed to mourn. Officially, it was denied, erased, forgotten. But memory has its own heartbeat. The survivors carried it forward, silent but unbroken. When the Second World War erupted, Ukraine once again became a battlefield. Cities were destroyed, families torn apart. Yet even in ruin, resistance flickered. Ukrainian partisans fought for survival, not for empire, not for ideology, but for the simple right to exist. After the war, Soviet banners rose again. Ukraine was rebuilt, industrialized, and silenced. The mystery of its true self was buried under propaganda and fear, but not forever. In 1986, when the reactor at Chernobyl exploded, the world saw the cracks in the Soviet facade. The disaster revealed more than radiation. It revealed truth, the decay of a system built on lies. And as the Soviet Union crumbled, the heartbeat of Ukraine grew louder. In 1991, it happened at last. Independence. The blue and yellow flag rose over Kyiv, not as a rebellion, but as a resurrection. That was the moment the mystery finally revealed its answer. Ukraine had not been born in 1991, it had been reborn. Every war, every famine, every whispered song had been leading here. 1,000 years of silence had spoken. And yet, the mystery is not over, because the story of Ukraine has never truly ended. It continues, in every field that turns golden with wheat, in every church bell that rings across the Dnipro, in every child who learns to say, "I am Ukrainian." The land remembers, the people remember, and the mystery of Ukraine remains the story of a nation that refuses to be forgotten.